So what do we mean by API versioning? Once you expose an API through a web API or really any REST-based API technology, it is done. You have customers and users that rely on it, so you can't change it. You have an implicit contract between you and these users and customers, those developers out there that have developed their applications against your API, which means that API can't go away. But of course, the requirements of what you're trying to build are likely to change, so you need to have a way to evolve them without breaking that implicit contract between you and those developers. API versioning isn't product versioning, so you're not just going to release a new version of the API every time you release a new product version. With luck, you're going to do less API versioning than you are going to do product versioning, but there's going to be cases where you're going to need to evolve and do both. It is typically a bad idea to tie the two concepts together. So the problem with API versioning is that it's very different from typical code versioning. Since you're looking at ASP.NET Web API, I'm going to make the assumption that you're a .NET developer. And because of that, you may be used to doing versioning in typical projects by producing new versions of the same package. This may mean that you're going to have a version 1 of the assembly and a version 2 of the assembly. And even though you can have those live side by side in different .NET implementations, you're not having to deal with both of those different versions in the same code base. That's where API versioning is different. You're going to be exposing out, in most cases, multiple versions of your API within the same ASP.NET project. So you have to have a way to deal with that versioning. Your API needs to support both new users that are going to use the latest version, as well as keep happy those developers that use the earlier versions of your API. You can't really do side-by-side deployment. You're going to be creating and supporting different versions of the API going forward. At some point, you may be able to sunset certain versions of the API, but you have to give developers a lot of notice that they'll have to change their code. This need to have both versions in the same code base means you're going to have similar functionality in different parts of your code base, and then have to have a way for Web API to detect which version the users are using and have them come in. Even more difficult is they may be using the original API you released, but you may be able to actually forward them to the new version of the API, and that'll be fine. And so the versioning may not be the entire API changes. It may be that certain parts of your API have changed. So that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at different ways that the developers are going to tell you what versions of the API they're going to use. Let's take a look at how we're going to create multiple versions of the same code in our code base first, and then we'll talk about how to differentiate them inside of Web API.